themselves. And so there is a responsibility, but there also has to be a humility that we also, as humans, with all our upbringing and our culture and our societies and institutions that we have, we can also, when it gets very close to home, become sometimes less than responsible. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we're in a complex era, but an era that's worth it, an era that's worth the challenge. And hopefully I can give you some feeling of that challenge and some responses to it. In this era, we are, of course, not necessarily well led. We seem to have stumbled into a new era at the end of the Cold War in the 80s, when we've seen all of a sudden so many nations imploding as they tried to structure themselves independently of the big world powers and, of course, the colonial masters that were there before them. And it is not as if we sort of anticipated that and we were prepared for many of these catastrophic failures in the humanitarian side or these conflicts that degenerated into civil wars. It sort of surprised us that in fact this would happen, knowing full well that the frictions of their differences, be they ethnicity, religion, tribalism, or just power sharing, dictators losing their jobs, would create situations of enormous difficulty. And so where are we? Where are we Canadians, in this exercise where bigger nations with much smaller nations were in these centuries of toing and froing? And how are we, in fact, assisting in advancing? Well, the first thing we've got to do is take a sort of a step back and look at what the situation is. And what we've discovered, in fact, over the last decade plus, is we've entered a world in a certain level of disorder, and not necessarily order. George Bush Sr. said, at the end of the Cold War, it would be a new world order. Well, I would contend it's a new world disorder. It's an era in which we are being very conscious of the fact that 80% of humanity is living in inhuman conditions, while we in the 20% are off to Mars. And we even say that humanity is advancing because we're off to Mars, even though 80% are in inhuman conditions. There's a disconnect. We can't have one side going completely and letting the other side fester. I mean, are they human too? Are they as human as us? Are they more vulnerable, potentially, than us? And do they have a right to be treated, to have aspirations, the basic aspirations of humanity, of being humans and being able to thrive, and their future generations? And so we've seen, in fact, in this era, not a progression of much of the resolution of conflicts and frictions that were long festering, but in fact we saw a degeneration of them into things like ethnic cleansing and imploding nations, interstate, not countries attacking each other as much as countries going into civil war, the people killing themselves. I mean, Rwandans killed Rwandans. There were influences from outside. In Sierra Leone, there were Sierra Leoneans killing themselves. In Sri Lanka, in Yugoslavia, it wasn't people from outside, it was themselves. And we've seen it degenerate to things like even genocide, something that we had said would never happen again after the Holocaust. And certainly we're trying to be influenced significantly to not let that happen. And so we had a terrible smell of it through Cambodia, the killing fees, but certainly Rwanda brought it back to us in spades. And so we're in an era that is not necessarily stable or easy, particularly when we want to assist in nations that are wrapped up in the throes of poverty and massive poverty and caught up in the conflicts. How do you develop and conduct development when in fact these nations are in conflict? Well, one thing we did realize finally is that the tools that we had to try to handle this era simply don't work.